Welcome to True Crime, Authors and Extraordinary People, the podcast where we bring two passions together. The show that gives new meaning to the old adage, truth is stranger than fiction, and reminding you that there is an extraordinary person in all of us. Here is your host, David McClam.
What's going on, everybody, and welcome to another episode of True Crime, Authors and Extraordinary People. Of course, I'm your man, David McClam. Hey, if you guys haven't already, make sure you follow us on all of our social media. One link to a link tree will get you every place you need to go pertaining to the show. And as I always remind you, if you are someone, you know someone that feels like hurting yourself or others, please leave this episode and dial 988. It is the suicide prevention hotline. It can get you the help that you need. And just in case someone else has told you today, let me be the first to tell you, I do care. And I do need you to be here. There is nothing worth your life. All right, guys. So here we are again at the dilemma and crossroad of I can have the person that's coming on the show today as both an author and an extraordinary person. Today is going to be here as an extraordinary person. And what I need you guys to do is if you are caring for someone that is elderly, or you know someone that is, or you're just interested in how hospice works, you need to listen to this show. You will find some revelations about myself that I have come to believe is true now that I've heard her show, as well as being the producer for the TS Radio Network and the Marty Oakley Show with Cause. So let me tell you who our guest is. Her mother was murdered by hospice in 2017, which led her to become an advocate to spread the truth and hopefully save others from losing loved ones. She then became a podcast host of Betrayed by Hospice in 2018, and in 2024 wrote the book Betrayed by Hospice and Healthcare, Stories from the Deathbed, that was published in March of 2025. Her passion is to share knowledge to save others. She is the author of Betrayed by Hospice and Healthcare, Stories from the Deathbed, an Extraordinary Person, Marsha Joiner. Marsha, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. I don't know about extraordinary, but I do have the passion for trying to save the elderly or anybody who doesn't know what's going on.
Well, I definitely feel that you are. I've got the privilege of editing a few of your episodes now because you're working with Cause on that. And believe me, there's a lot of revelation that's there. And we'll get into a little bit of my story here in a little bit. And you can tell me if I'm right or wrong.
Okay.
So I guess my first question I ask everybody that comes on the show, is there anything else that we should know about Marsha Joiner that was not in your introduction?
I love my family. I'm very close to my family, and I'm empty nester now with two adorable puppies who are like my children. I got into this because of the love of my mother. She was my best friend, and I talked to her almost daily. So it was... It shattered our family quite a bit. So that's kind of who I am. I am a Christian, and I believe in God, and I, don't make any apologies for that. And I think we all need to protect ourselves and protect our loved ones.
Well, you're on the right show. My audience knows I am indeed as well a Christian. I have no apologies about that. I've shared my faith with my audience before. My recent episode is about to come out. It's probably going to share that again. So yes, we have no shame of being Christians here. I guess my very first question, because I come to find out that a lot of people are confused about what hospice is or what it does. Before what unfortunately happened to your mom, did you know anything about hospice?
I did. And my relationship or knowledge of hospice is a little bit different from most people, in that my father was the hospice chaplain at that particular facility in Georgia. And he's obviously he was a pastor, a very Christian man. And he worked for them 15 years and then had retired 10 years earlier, almost when he was 80, he retired. So when hospice said, when the medical director of the hospice facility said that my mom qualified because she had congestive heart failure, we didn't think that that was going to be a danger zone. And I think that looking back on it now, we trusted them because of the relationship that my dad had with them. And I think other people trust the relationship because, we all hear the man in the white suit, and nurses are, they're angels, and hospice is compassionate. So I thought that's exactly what we were headed into, even though my sister asked, "You won't hasten her death, will you?" And they said, "Oh, no, we don't do that. We won't prolong her life, but we won't hasten her death." So we were very, naive in thinking that she was safe because they knew that my dad loved her and she was the light of his life. So that was, my initiation, I had for, 20 years with a situation with my father. That answer what you were asking me?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
So when people like myself, lay people, never dealt with hospice before, what do you think we think hospice is when we hear the word hospice?
Oh, sure. Well, if I can go back in history just a little bit. In 1967, Dame Cicely Saunders created hospice. And she was a very compassionate woman, and it was for people who were actively dying, and it was meant to minimize pain. But over the years, it became a situation where, and it is a very follow the money situation, where they started to say, well, if somebody has 6 months to live, that's not actively dying, but it's 6 months, and we can bring them in, and then we can start to administer compassionate care to them and to their families. And that is what it was supposed to be, to give spiritual, support to the families as well as the patient who is dying. But now almost anything qualifies you. If you have dementia, well, yes, you can say that's an incurable disease, but that doesn't mean you're actively dying. Congestive heart failure, COPD, kidney disease, even cancer. I mean, you don't have a short period of time. Your period of time could be more than 6 months. It could be a year. It could be 2 weeks. So we got away from the actively dying, which would be somebody who's like, 2 weeks, 10 days, someone who is already starting to show the degradation. They're not eating, they're not drinking on their own, not because they're drugged, but on their own. They've given up doing that. They can't get up and get out of bed. They're sleeping, 14, 20 hours a day. And you're in a phase where your body is shutting down. And that is what it was meant for. And then you only minimize pain. If somebody is not in pain, there is no reason to give them opioids. They're not anxious. There's no reason to give them anti-anxiousness pills or anti-anxiety medication. But that is, as I go through, I'll explain that it's a one size fits all. And it is not for the person actively dying. It's happening to people that the doctor says that they have, a disease or a comorbidity where they've got 2 diseases, but they're not actively dying. And medication could make them live 2 years, 5 years, 8 years. When hospice comes in, that period of time is shortened. Some people say they hasten death. And I belong to a group called Murdered by Hospice, and they get a little upset if I say hasten death because that's kind of sugarcoating it. It's murder. So that's what's important for people to know. And people will say, my loved one died peacefully in their sleep. And hospice was so compassionate, and they were so kind to us and to the family and to my loved one. And that's what the internet is going to tell you. And a lot of people do say that. Maybe that's true, but just maybe, if you consider that if a person is drugged into a coma, they're sleeping. So I could have easily thought, if I had not gone down to see my mother and my dad had said, your mother died peacefully in her sleep, well, I would have gone along with that. I would have said, okay, he knew that, especially since he had been a hospice chaplain. So people can be told that, your loved one is, they're passing, they're in their sleep, they died peacefully in their sleep. But how else do you die if you're drugged to death and you're in a coma? You die in your sleep. So I think a lot of people are misled and manipulated by what they're told. And it is much easier to believe that than to think that your loved one was tortured, as my mother was, and I witnessed it.
So just to let you know what I think of when I hear the word hospice, and I think of that more now than any, is when somebody says, I have somebody going to hospice, I automatically think death. Because from the things I have seen or read before, hospice is where you go when you're at the end of life. So up until my research and listening to you on your show and cause, I'm thinking, okay, so these people's going to hospice. They're at the end of life. There's nothing else they can do for them. Maybe they went through all the medical care they were supposed to. So we're just going to give them, because the way they explained it to me is we're just going to give them life-saving drugs to prolong to make them feel more comfortable. But in the end, just know that your loved one is going to die type situation. So what I want to do before I get into mine is I want you to give us, can you give us a little bit of the story of your mom, how she ended up getting to hospice, what made you take the road that you are now?
Sure. So in 2016, my mom, she had no cartilage in her left hip, and they couldn't operate on it because the doctor had said, because she had congestive heart failure, he was afraid she would not come out from the surgery. So they didn't do that. So there's her pain level. And she always said a pain level of 8 out of 10 was okay with her because she was afraid of drugs. She was afraid of opioids. When I was down there visiting her in October of 2016, she was kind of off balance. She couldn't take direction right. If you said, go forward, she walked back. And she was just very weak and anemic. So her doctor said, instead of taking him to the doctor's office, take her to the hospital. So they took her to the hospital, and the hospitalist there, which we can talk about that later, the hospitalist there said he wanted to do a colonoscopy and an endoscopy. Well, because I'm worried about my mom going under, it upset me, and I cried, and I said, Mom, I'm afraid for you to go under, because what if you don't come back? So she told the doctor that if it upset her daughter, she wouldn't do it, because that's how my mother was. She was more concerned about me than herself. But I said, Mom, if that's, do you really want to know if you have cancer or if there's something going? She said, I do. I acquiesced. She had it. She came out from under it. There was nothing that they found. There was no cancer. They did not find that she was bleeding internally. She just happened to be anemic. Would iron have helped that? Maybe. Would there have, vitamin B12? I mean, was there something that could have helped that? Possibly. But the first thing the medical director of the hospice went to was, she qualifies for hospice. So there again, our family thought she would be safe because of my dad's relationship with those people in hospice. So in November of 2016, she was enrolled in hospice. Early December, I received a phone call that she had fallen. And I said, well, what happened? Is she anemic again? Did you test her? And they said, well, we're not going to do that. We're not going to take her to the hospital. We're not going to test that. We want to put her in a hospital bed. At that time, I said, if you put her in a hospital bed, she will give up, because she has a lift chair in the living room. She visits with people. They come over to see her. Her neighbors call her. The people from the church call. She's even though she was chair bound most of the time because of her bad hip, she was very active. She watched TV. We had a healthcare person that we paid for privately that came in a couple of days a week to give her a bath. And they would sit and watch The Pioneer Woman and recipes. So she's very active. So I said, I just don't think that was a good idea. I let it go at that when I talked to my dad and my mom that night. And I said, what happened? Now, remember, hospice told me they didn't know what happened. So the story, what happened is when their CNA, certified nursing assistant, came and went to help my mom up from her lift chair to her bedside potty, they dropped her. Yeah, not intentional. They just didn't know. They weren't trained on how to get her up gently so that she had her balance. She lost her balance. She fell. Apparently, she broke her tailbone. Well, and I'm going to stop now and say that the medical records are crucial, and they're crucial to get while your loved one is still alive so that you can find out what's going on. I didn't know what hospice was saying, what they were writing down, until after I got the medical records, after my mother was dead. So it's real important to get those. So what had happened, I told you the CNA had accidentally dropped her. They had called 911. 911 had come out, it helped her get up. The report in the medical records said that the CNA received a phone call from my dad who said my mother had fallen. It was like an hour and a half, 2 hours past the time that the CNA was physically at the house. Now, how do I know this? One, because my dad told me. Two, my mother's health provider that we paid told me what had happened the next day. And I contacted the police department, and I got a USB drive of what time they received that call. So I know what time they received it. Hospice lied on the medical record and said that the CNA was on her way there when my dad called. That is not what happened. So they weren't angry at her. They weren't planning on, filing any charges or, firing them or nothing. They just took it as it was an accident. So, time passes by, and my sister and I were there, I believe in February. One of the hospice nurses who knew my dad well was standing in the kitchen talking to me and made the comment that your mother doesn't appreciate your dad. And I said, what are you talking about? She said, she yells at him. And I said, when does she yell at him? Well, when he doesn't hear what she's saying and she's yelling. And I said, he doesn't turn his hearing aids up. And if he doesn't hear, how else do you think that he's going to hear her if she doesn't raise her voice? Now, throughout my life, my mom and dad never yelled, and we never heard them fight. To my knowledge, they never did. So a funny story is when my sister and I both got married and we had an argument with our husbands, we thought it was the end of the relationship because my parents never fought. So to hear this lady say that my mom was yelling at my dad, I dismissed it because it wasn't relevant. I knew it wasn't true. And my sister also had a conversation with them that they said that when my mom's oxygen was low and they didn't have the moisture, because when it's in your nose all the time, it, makes your nose dry, and that it didn't have moisture in it, and that she would fuss at my dad. Again, we never heard my mom fuss at my dad, and we lived with them. So my sister and I thought, well, since hospice is there, the nurse is there one day and the CNAs are there 2 days. Why wouldn't that be one of the things that they do? Check the water, make sure there's water in the oxygen. And, she didn't have it on all the time, but when she, would go to sleep at night, she would have her oxygen on. So why wouldn't that be something they would have checked? We didn't think much more about it, but looking back, then what came to our mind is that because my dad was a hospice chaplain and they cared about him and knew him, that they felt she was a burden to him, and that is why ultimately in the end that they got rid of her. I have found out since then that that's not it, because my mother is not an anomaly. She was not the only person that was murdered. It's happening everywhere. But at that time, I didn't know it. So her doctor had recertified her, and then he had gone to India for 3 weeks. That is when our entire family, that's when things started to shatter for us, because hospice, the 2 nurses that I told you about, both of them he had worked with. One of them was quite older and just kind of was in the office, right? So they show up at the house and they told my mother and my dad that they were going to take her to the respite care facility, so my dad could get rest, and then they would bring her back in a couple of days. I didn't know that. She called me. I was outside cutting the grass, and when I came in and got her message, she said, nothing important, but give me a call. Well, when I called, nobody answered. They had already taken her to this facility. Once I found that out from my sister, I started calling each day and talking to her. She went in on a Friday, and on Tuesday when I called, she wasn't answering the phone anymore. And my dad said she's sleeping all the time. She won't wake up. She won't take her medication, and she won't eat. That was an alarm to me. So I called the facility and said, what's going on? And they said, well, we're giving her morphine, Ativan, and 100 micrograms of fentanyl. That's what they were putting her in a coma. That's what had happened. They didn't say that. So my sister and I talked, and we told them to stop the morphine and the Ativan. That was 2017, when nobody had heard about fentanyl, and people, the police officers touching the granules and, going into cardiac arrest or stop breathing. And then they were giving them Narcan. We never heard of fentanyl. We thought it was like Lidoderm that she had taken before, Lidoderm patch that she took, for her hip, which was not toxic by any means. So fentanyl, I'll stop now and tell you that fentanyl is 100 times stronger than morphine and 50 times stronger than heroin. And it is done in patches, fentanyl patches, with the first one being 12.5 micrograms, and then it goes to 25. Then it can do, a 25 one and a 12.5, so you'd be at 37.5. And then they go to 50 to 25s. Well, they had put my mother on 2 50 microgram patches, giving her 100 micrograms. That is an extreme amount to be given somebody.
Kill a horse with that.
Exactly. Right. So, again, getting the medical records, because I didn't know all of this until I got the medical records after she was gone. It says in the medical records, first off, Friday night, when she got there and they started giving her morphine, they came in Saturday morning and she was crying, and they asked her what was wrong. And she said, I am afraid of morphine. And they told her that what she was taking for her hip was causing constipation, and this would be better. Well, morphine causes constipation. So again, that's an outright lie. When I read the medical records, I didn't know that until I started doing research. It also stated that on Monday, and then they gave her Ativan. Ativan is for anxiety. Was she anxious? I don't know. But, they gave it to her. That can also cause depressed breathing. So you've given somebody morphine, which causes depressed breathing, even though they say it will help somebody breathe. Well, it will if it's a small amount and you're not giving it to them every 4 hours. And then eventually they increase it to every 2 hours. Then you give them Ativan, which also causes respiratory depression. So you're putting two together. And it says in the BEERS, BEERS, it states, do not give these two drugs together, except if in hospice, because the intent in hospice is to end their life. So any other time you shouldn't give that to them. But in hospice, all bets are off and anything goes, which is why later I'll discuss why attorneys don't take that case. And then if you add fentanyl to that, which is a depressor, and it puts them in a coma, and all of these together can cause hallucinations, they cause coma, they cause death. It says don't add those together. There is a list called drugs.com that you can put drug interactions in there, and you can see for yourself what it does to a person. So fast forward, my sister arrives, I arrive, we try to take her to the hospital, and they say, if you take her to the hospital, she'll get fluid around her heart and she'll die from drowning. And you don't want that, do you, sweetie? They sound compassionate. They sound like they care. We didn't want my mother to suffer. We wanted her to come home. So when they say that to you, it's a manipulation. It's an outright lie. But you don't know, you're sleep deprived, you're terrified of losing your loved one. And when they say that to you, you think, well, that must be true. And, we had stopped the morphine and the Ativan, knew nothing about the fentanyl, not realizing how very potent it was. And so one of the nurses said to my sister, one of the nurses that took her there, my sister said something about taking her to the hospital. And, she said, the nurse, well, she's been off of the morphine and the Ativan for over 24 hours. So it's not the drugs. I mean, she's just actively dying. Well, you take her to this facility and now all of a sudden she's actively dying. I mean, really, you're God, that that's her when her time was coming. And the social worker that was there said to my sister, now I'm not there at the time, I'm traveling, I'm 13 hours away, and my sister's like 5 or 6. And so the social worker says to my sister, well, maybe if you want to go ahead and go do that, and then you'll know for sure. The nurse looked at her so harshly that she physically backed up and never said another word. And then that's when the nurse said, she would die from drowning. So that was kind of the end of that. Now, when I arrived, I tried the same tactic, take her to the hospital. They gave me the same thing. So day after day, we sat in that room, in sitting in the chairs that they have there. And, I had to take my puppies with me, and we sat there while they drugged her, and we tried to stop that. And eventually they talked my sister into believing that she was in pain, because if you wince, if you furrow your eyebrow, if you, move in any type of manner, if you moan, anything that you do, oh, she's in pain. We need to start the pain medication back. And they guilt you into thinking that if you don't do it, you're allowing your loved one to be in pain. And the medical records said that daughters said they did not care if their mother was in pain. And that is not what we said. But then I'll go back to the medical records and how they alter them to tell their story of what they want you to see. We never said we didn't care if our mother was in pain. We said we wanted her to live. We wanted her to go to the hospital because something was seriously wrong. You don't go from sitting up. Our care provider, April, who I love like a sister, she went to see her on Sunday because I had called her up and told her what was going on. She went to see her on Sunday. She was sitting up. She was eating her dinner. And she asked April to give her her makeup bag. She was putting on makeup and asked April to fix her hair. She's looking at my dad's phone. April sent me a picture of it. And she is completely alert. By Monday, when they started the 100 micrograms of fentanyl, by Tuesday, she was in a coma. And I have pictures of those days. The cover of the book, and you'll see there's a red heart over my mother's face, a broken heart, because it did break her heart. But my mother would never want anybody to see her laying in this bed in a coma with her mouth agape. And that is when we walked down the hall in this hospice facility, that the patients were laying there, every one of them laying in the bed with their mouth agape. And it's the end of them dying. And my mother died. We lost the battle. And that following Friday, the nurse went to put on 2 50 microgram patches of the fentanyl. I was grasping at straws and I said, no, I don't want you to put the second one on there. And she goes, well, we need to go out in the hall. The hearing is the last to go. So we go out in the hall and she says, if we don't put this second patch on your mom, she would be chasing pain. And you don't want your mom to be in pain, do you? And we won't be able to catch up to it. And I said, no, but I want to take her home. I want her better. Well, we need to keep the pain down. They manipulate, they lie. And even though we knew that there was something seriously wrong, we just didn't have the power. We didn't have the strength. We didn't have the knowledge to back it up and say, I'm taking my mom out of here. She's going to the hospital, no matter what you say. And doing it again, besides never letting her be in hospice. Secondly, I would have taken her to the hospital if I had to have the police there, if I had to wheel her out myself. I would never have listened to them. So when we got the medical records and read what they had written in there, and how she had reactions after she got the fentanyl, she had her feet, her knees pushed up, her striking out at the air, fist clenched. I mean, that was not my mother, and that was her horrible reaction from the drugs. And I did a spreadsheet on the medications that they gave her, and they would come in and ask her what her pain level was. Are you in pain? Even when she said no, they gave her more morphine. They gave her more Ativan. Even when she was in a coma and wasn't awake, and they would say, no noticeable pain, seems to be resting comfortably. The next thing you know, in the chart, more morphine, more Ativan. It is murder.
My question is, so all of these people that are taking care of your mom or anybody else in the hospice, they're certified nurses. They went to training. They went to school. They are supposed to know what drugs do, especially what combination drugs do. Why do you think then that they're being complicit to murder? Because if you're giving somebody a cocktail of drugs that literally says, don't give this to anybody else unless you're in hospice, why do you think that they put their career on the line for that?
Well, because there are no consequences. There are no consequences. If you've got the beer's list, which is, for anybody over 65, what you shouldn't give them. And in that, it has a paragraph, except in hospice. You got to remember that these people are trained to be hospice nurses. You have nurses that work in doctor's office. You have nurses that work in hospitals, nurses that are in nursing homes. These are hospice nurses. They are trained that this is what they're supposed to do. Marty Oakley, God rest her soul, she had gone one time to be a hospice volunteer. Not as a nursing assistant, but they have people that volunteer their time to, go over and sit with patients and to talk to patients, maybe take them food and things like that. So she had gone and she sat there and she said that they were telling the people that were considering volunteering that, here's how you talk to the family. You tell the family that, your loved one has lived a long life and they're tired, and you just hanging on to them and not letting them go, is cruel. You need to let them go, and you need to say your goodbyes. And they tell the patient the reverse. You've lived a long life and your loved one has taken care of you, and, they've had to give up their life to take care of you, and you just need to go. You need to, let go and realize that it's your time. Those are the things that you're saying to the patient and the patient's family. So I believe these nurses are trained that, this is what you give them. The doctor does a PRN, which means as needed. And so the nurse can determine as needed. And if they come in, I believe they are trained that they start out maybe at every 6 hours that they're given morphine and Ativan, and then they increase it, and then it's every 4 hours, and then it's every 2 hours. And I don't think they think much about it. Now, I think that there are some people, and I had, done a podcast one time about people, doctors and nurses that literally kill people, using, Clorox and, doing this heinous crimes. There's an awesome book on that. But I think some of them are just evil, and I think some of them are ignorant. And I think just what you said, that if you're a nurse, you should know that putting morphine, Ativan, and fentanyl together is a danger zone, and that it is going to stop their breathing, and it is going to put them in a coma. And if you keep giving it to them, you're going to murder them. That is exactly what's going to happen. And I think that they just think this is what we're supposed to do. This is what we're told to do. This is how quickly we do it. And either they don't know that these are the effects of those drugs and the combination of them, they don't know. And in that case, if they don't know, they ought not to be administering them. And if they do know, then they're complicit in murder. And they get away with it because when you try to get an attorney to take a case on hospice, the first thing that the thought is, which, to your point that you said earlier, that when somebody goes in hospice, that means you're going to die. So you're talking to an attorney, which I talked to about a dozen of them after my mother was murdered. And well, they were in hospice. What did you expect? And the question is, well, how old were they? Well, my mom was 87. She wasn't working. There was no monetary value. She wasn't bringing in an income. So you didn't lose the income of that person, whether it was your spouse. We've had people 58 years old and that person was still earning an income. But when they look at the hospice people, you're not earning an income. There is no money you're not getting. It's not about money. It's about the fact that is a life that you have taken from this earth. It's about murder. It's not about money. But attorneys will not take the case because they said, I had one tell me this at the end. And he said, it sounds like you've talked to a lot of attorneys. Do you want me to really tell you why they won't take it? And I said, absolutely. Because hospice has mass mutual insurance. They do not settle out of court, and it would cost us more money to get witnesses in and come in than we would ever be able to make. So they don't do that. And you got to realize that when you look across, United States, how many hospices exist? Privately owned, Vitus Hospice is the biggest hospice in the United States, but they're all different ones. So if you went to sue, you would be suing one particular facility, because people have said, well, why don't we get together and, do like a case, all of us together? Well, you can't do that because the hospices are owned by all different people. So what the issue is that Medicare is funding it. And as long as that is the case, then Medicare funds it. The government saves money because it is cheaper to kill than it is to cure or to care for someone who has comorbidities or, cancer or, whatever is wrong with them. It's cheaper to eliminate them. And the hospice facilities, they're popping up everywhere because there is a lot of money in dying people. And there are a lot of elderly. And think about the generation that's coming up now, the baby boomers. Tremendous money in hospice. So they're going to make money, and the nurses are going to make money for, think about, if you're in the hospice respite facility, what do you have to do? They don't even have to change a bedpan to put a catheter in somebody, and, you drug them to death, and within 7 to 10 days, they're dead. So they make money. The problem is that the people are paying with their life, and you're shattering families.
This means, well, I've always thought this anyway, that the government is one of the biggest hypocrites there is. If you remember years ago, and this always comes to mind when I hear hospice stories, there was a man named Dr. Jack Kevorkian. Kevorkian was put away because he was assisting people in suicide. Now, these are people that come to him and say, hey, I want you to do this. They signed releases. They made statements like, I don't want to live in pain anymore. But it was a crime. It was murder, right? They said it was assisted murder. This is nothing but government assisted murder. It's the exact same thing that Kevorkian was doing, except for the people that's in hospice is not telling you they want to die. You have them and you have family members saying, we want to live. It should be up to you to save my life. It's the biggest hypocrisy I've ever seen. And it upsets me greatly because I think my mom was attributed to this, which if you like, I'll tell you a little bit about that now. What I'm about to tell you, I've never shared with anybody. So my audience and a lot of my family members only know that my mom passed in 2020. Didn't tell them why. So they're going to know today. So my mom came to live with us in 2018. When she came, she had this horrific cough that never went away. And my cousin who she lived with said, hey, Aunt Terry has this cough. She won't go get it looked at. So we had her go get it looked at, and turned out that she had cancer. She had some cancer in the throat. And the doctor said, but this is curable. There's not a problem. We're just going to go in. We're going to take this out. We'll see where it goes. Well, that's exactly what happened. My mom came out and he says, okay, everything went fine. We're going to check in a couple of weeks. And then that doctor released her to another doctor. Finds out he wasn't giving her the proper medication that he should have been. So the cancer from her throat now comes back, but it metastasizes in her arm. Now, this leads to her now having surgery on her arm to remove that cancer. Same doctor says it's going to be fine. Everything's great. Gave me the pictures, a whole nine. My mom was perfect. Was going to the hospital to see him every couple of weeks. Never gave her a bad bill of health. He did say, I think you maybe should take a little radiation because I know it's going to be taxing on the body, but it's probably going to help get this away. So they have put a stem in my mom's chest so that she didn't have to have it put in every time she went in for radiation. After about 4 weeks of that, he was like, well, it's working. We're going to keep you on this and come back and see me in a couple of weeks. My mom comes home that day from the doctor. 20 minutes later, we get a knock on the door. We're like, who's at the door? Who's showing up here? And open the door and they're like, yeah, is Terry Hester here? I'm like, yeah, who are you? And they're like, well, we're from Vitus Hospice. And I'm like, why are you here at my house? Well, if we can come in, we can explain. Well, your mom has been put in hospice by her doctor. The doctor's saying that she is very sick and now she's coming to that point at the end of life. Now, my mom was sitting right here, but they pulled me up to a corner of my house so they can talk to me about this. So what do I do? Now, my mom's my whole world. And I would do the same thing to save my wife's life. I'm on the phone. I'm calling the doctor. And I'm like, what doctor prescribed my mom to go into hospice? And they're like, well, we don't know. I'm like, if you hear, how the hell do you not know who prescribed my mom to go into hospice? So I called the doctor she just came from. Then I called the surgeon. Both of them is like, we didn't send your mom to hospice. We have no idea. We thought your mom signed herself in because, as you may know, now he gave my mom a bunch of prescriptions to keep her out of pain and was supposed to be able to save or keep her life alive because of the metastasization. But as you know, when hospice stepped in, all of my mom's medicine mysteriously got canceled. And I'm like, well, we're on the way to get her drugs now. They're like, well, don't worry about those drugs because she's not going to get them. I'm like, what do you mean she's not going to get them? Well, now that your mom has been put into hospice by a doctor, she needs to sign this paper. And when she signs this paper, then this is going to give her the drugs in which she needs. And I'm like, I don't understand. If you can't tell me the doctor that put my mom in here, what do you mean she has to sign this paper to get her drugs? Now, they had this paper that did have the list of drugs you're supposed to take and a spot for her to sign. And then they told me the world's biggest lie. They said, well, if your mom signed this paper, we can get her the drugs today. They'll come delivered within the next 2 hours. If it is decided that she was put in hospice by a mistake, you can automatically reverse this. She'll be out of hospice in 24 hours. No harm, no foul. Biggest lie. Because I finally get a hold of the doctor that put my mom into hospice. Some female doctor we never heard of. And she was in like 3 towns over from us. And I'm like, I don't understand how you get this case. Well, it was brought to my attention by who? I said, both of her doctors is telling me that they don't even know who you are. And she switches the conversation to how sick my mother is. She's a woman that's on her deathbed. We just need to let her go. We're trying to make sure that she's comfortable. And I'm like, my mom is laying in the room right now, perfectly of sound mind and health. She can speak in the whole nine. There's nothing wrong. She just came from a doctor's appointment. But see, what they knew is, when I found out about listening to your podcast and Cause, is they knew that if they removed those drugs that my mom was supposed to have, her life would deteriorate.
That's right.
So this doctor spewing me all this stuff. At the same time, I'm on the phone with the doctor. I'm getting a call from the hospital where my mom is, because she has this episode where she ends up having to be taken out and go to the hospital. And this was like a day after hospice came to the house. And they're like, oh, we need you. Your mom tells us that you are her only caregiver. The last words I heard my mom speak was they asked her from the ambulance, who is in charge of your care? We're actually on the phone from the hospital. And she said, it's my son. That's the last words my mom ever spoke. Okay. And so she's like, well, we need to give her morphine because she's in great pain. And I'm like, what is she in pain from? I'm like, before she left out of here, she wasn't in pain. We had her carried out of here because we think she's having hallucinations. We think she's going septic. And because she was making comments that night before, like the tube in her chest had come out or something like that, which we know it couldn't. And so I'm like, Moms will see the doctor today at noon, but we need to get her out of here. So we called the ambulance. I said, we think she's going septic right now. Oh, well, she's in great pain. We need to give her morphine. So then they're like, you can come up and see her. Marsha, I kid you not, my mom couldn't speak. She was like a deaf mute. She was on the bed. She was trying to communicate something with me, but couldn't. It was like, whatever they had in this drip. My mom's life deteriorated from a 24-hour point to where they're telling me, well, we're just doing whatever we can to keep her comfortable. And I'm still questioning. I don't understand. My mom was perfectly fine before she left here. You got this doctor telling me that my mom is dying when all of the surgeons that she had has already told me that the cancer is taken care of, is pretty much in remission. No one's giving explanations of how hospice even gets here. We didn't call. My mom didn't call. But when she signed that paper to get the drugs that she needed, which they didn't even give her all of that, she basically signed her death warrant. We didn't know that, right? I've never dealt with hospice before. I'm in shock as the son as, why are you here at my house? Because when you say the word hospice, that means somebody's dying. No one's dying in this house until you make them die. So when they carried her out of here, and I was looking over this whole thing, I was like, because my wife was like, well, maybe. I said, I think my mom was killed by hospice. And she goes, well, how did you come to this conclusion? And I said, Beth, when you produce some shows, you learn a lot of stuff. And I said, until I met Kaz and until I went on her show, because I went on her show in July because she wanted me to talk about some tech tips and things about podcasting. And then that's when Kaz told me what she did. She goes, yeah, I'm with the TS Radio Network and the Marty Oakley show. She told me what Marty did. And I was like, yeah, Kaz, I've been kind of looking into this because something doesn't feel right. Then you came along, right? She's like, well, part of the network, we're going to have Marsha Joiner. And she's running her own podcast on it called Betrayed by Hospice. I'm like, okay, cool. So then you started bringing in these people that was talking about the same thing. And I'm sitting here going, the more I sit here, the more I'm going to tell the world that my mom was killed by hospice, because before she left here and before they involuntarily made her sign into hospice, and between then and the hospital, she went from good, worse to dead. My mom was in the hospital 3 days. And I'll tell you how that works before I get your opinion on this. They called me the first day and said, can you come up? So I went up. And I saw my mom, and it broke my heart because my mom couldn't speak. She's trying to communicate. I've always felt guilty. I told my mom's death anniversary this year, I'm like, I feel like I killed my mom because I didn't know what I was doing. She didn't know what she was doing. I'm trying to get her out of it. And my mom couldn't speak. They called me the next day and they said, they started giving me this spiel about how maybe I wanted to come up to the hospital because my mom may not make it, and maybe I want to see her one last time. And I'm sitting here going, what's all this coming from? So I told my wife, I'm like, okay, we got to gear up to go to the hospital. They're telling me that my mom's on her last breath, pretty much. And they say, well, you may have some hours. So as me and my wife's preparing ourselves to get ready to go to the hospital, I get the call midnight saying, we're sorry to tell you, but your mom has passed. And COVID did me no justice because of the fact that everybody that wanted to get away with murdering somebody in a hospital, all they had to do was put down that they died of COVID symptoms. And everybody was believing it because my mom even started complaining about some of the hospitals that she went into because she's like, well, since you can't be there, man, we get mistreated by the nurses. We get yelled at. So, of course, on the death certificate, and here's what really made me say, yeah, this is because you and Kaz always talk about manipulating the death certificate or making it seem like it was a past illness that killed him. Man, on this death certificate, they went back to some time, my mom had lung cancer. It went back to her smoking for 20 plus years. And then it went into this whole entire spiel of, yeah, we think that she died with a combination of cancer and COVID, even though the doctor had told me she didn't have COVID and she was surprised that she didn't. So what's your thoughts? I think that my mom was killed by hospice at this point.
Yeah, I have no doubt. And I'll tell you how they got to you. In the hospital, if you have you've been to the hospital 3 times in the time frame, 6 months or a year, then you get flagged as a frequent flyer. And that is a hospice term that they use, a frequent flyer. And there are hospices that have contracts with hospitals. And there are some, depending on how big your area is, there may be a hospital that has 2 or 3 different hospices that are vying for business. And it's almost like they troll the hospitals. And I have people in the book, Jackie Ferrara, that they came up to her in the hospital and said, your husband's been here, 3 or 4 times. He keeps coming back and, he doesn't want to keep coming in here, for this. And we can send a nurse to your place and take care of him there so he doesn't have to come back in the hospital. And that's the way in the door, because who would say, yes, I want to keep coming back to the hospital every 3 months? I mean, nobody would, right? So that's where hospice gets a lot of their patients, from the nursing homes and from the hospitals. And they do troll them, and they do have quotas. A friend of mine wrote Killing for Profit, The Dark Side of Hospice, Michelle Young Doers, and they had quotas. She was a hospice respiratory nurse. And they have quotas, and they come into the hospitals. And there was on page 34 of my book. So when you get to that page, make sure you read this, and there's a website, a YouTube you can go to, where the guy is talking about how to keep the cap down so your hospice makes money. And I'm surprised it's still up, but it is. And he says that you want to make sure, that you're getting leads from people that are giving short LOS, which is length of service, and find out which hospice is getting the shorter length of service. In other words, which hospice gets the people that are dying quicker. And those are the people that you want to market to. So if it's a hospital, then you want to market to that hospital so that you can get shorter length of service so that you don't go over your cap. Because there is an aggregate cap, an annual cap each year. Last year was $34,465. I've got to check and see what it is for fiscal year 26, but it changes every year. And so if a person comes in, he gives an example. In the year that he was talking about, that the aggregate cap was at $32,000. So he says, if you have a patient that's there and they are alive for a month, they use about 6,000 of that, which leaves a delta of 26,000. And you can use that 26,000 for other patients. So in other words, it's like a pot of money. In your mother's case, you said she was murdered in 5 days.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and that was in 2020. So it was probably, 33,000, something like that they got, even though your mother only lived 5 days, they got that amount of money, and they can use that for other patients. It is a money-driven, greed-based agency. That's what hospice is. It's about money and greed. And when they took your mother, 2 things here that came to me, and 3. My first is how sorry I am that you didn't know, and you were as naive as we were, so many people. But the first thing is, if the doctor went through and did the surgery on your mom for your mom to recover from that and said that it hadn't metastasized anywhere else and that she was going to be okay and to stay on this medication, he gave her that medication, and you took her home, and then all of a sudden somebody from the hospital had notified hospice, or hospice had asked, who do we think is going to be a good candidate for hospice? They had given them that, which to me should be against HIPAA laws. They had given them your mother's name. Then they came in after your mom went through the surgery and, we can help her, and, she's going to die. And the doctor that apparently signed off for her to be enrolled, because the doctor has to sign off to enroll her, he had never even seen her. And, her regular doctors had said she's going to be okay. They said they did not know anything about this. So the hospital or the hospice, went to the hospital, or the hospital went to the hospice, whichever. Are they getting kickbacks? I'll tell you a case where, yes, they do. I don't know about your particular one, but they do in cases, and those are rogue hospices, but they do exist. So they immediately took your mother's medication away from her, which is going to make her go downhill, the fact that she doesn't have it. And when you said that you got to the hospital and that your mother could not see you,
she couldn't speak to me. She could see me, but she could speak.
That was one of the things that when I got down to see my mother, she did not recognize me, did not even see me. And her eyes were like blurred, like glassy blurred. And Liz Eisner, who is the founder of Murdered by Hospice Facebook group, her husband was 58, Alan, when he died. And when he left from the hospital to go to the hospice because they did not have a place for him in the rehabilitation facility. So he went to the physical hospice facility. Could not see him, talk to him or anything until she signed the hospice papers, thinking this was just going to be, a day, and then we're going to get him into a rehab facility. When she got in the room, they had already drugged him because they said he was anxious. He could not see her. And he said, "Is that my wife? I can't see you." That was my first realization, that when I was in my mother's room, that she could not see me. Because my mom always got excited when she saw me. So here I drive 3 states, down to see her, and she couldn't see me. Your mother could not see you at that point because of the drugs that she had been given. And she couldn't talk to you. They stole that from you. Why? Because of greed. What's the point in putting your mother through surgery like that if there was no hope? And why would the 2 doctors say, just continue to take this medication, let her recover from that? And, at your house, she was fine when they showed up. But you didn't know, and she didn't know. And that is why you do these podcasts. That's why Kaz does. That's why I do. That's why we all speak out, because you do not know what you do not know. And knowledge is power. And that's what we all need to have. We need to have the knowledge.
Man, yeah, because I haven't felt bad because my mom did have a reputation that she's very stubborn. And the first thing they said when I got to the hospital is, can you kind of talk to your mom because she's being combative and she doesn't want to take this and that. At the same time, my mom's trying to communicate but can't get any words out. And I said, are you being ornery? And the more I asked the question, are you not cooperating? The more agitated she became.
Yeah.
Well, I said to the nurse, I'm like, why can't my mom speak to me? And she seems to be very agitated. The fact that I'm even asking for her to cooperate. And they gave me some song and dance about how it's just the drugs taking effect and she should be able to talk soon. And they're not doing anything to her that shouldn't be done. She's just agitated because of the state in which she's in.
She's agitated because of what they're getting. The medication has made her agitated, and now she is afraid, and she's trying to fight back.
So for 5 years, I've dealt with this and I've went over it. And I tell everybody who listens, because we have a couple of people that we have friends that has elderly people now. My sister-in-law, unfortunately, at 45, dropped dead a couple months ago. So now we're taking care of her mom, which is my wife's adoptive mom. And I was like, I don't care if she can't walk, talk, sit, eat, breathe. As long as we're breathing, she's not going to hospice. We're not putting her in no home. Because that was the thing that my wife and I talked about before we was married. We said, how do we feel about the older people in our life being our parents? And I was like, well, we can't agree that I'm never putting my mom in a home. We have a problem. And she goes, nope, that's exactly where I'm at. So we took care of my mom and her dad up until the time that they passed. But I wanted to put this story here today since you're on the show. I look at you as somewhat of an expert on it. But the more I kept hearing these shows I'm producing and the more I keep hearing people talk out, I can't remember her name, but there was a recent one that we just did that I think Kaz put up where the young lady actually fought her way out of hospice because they were actually trying to kill her.
Are you talking about Gail Seiler?
Yeah, that's her.
Okay, that was in the hospital.
Okay.
Yeah. Right.
But I was like, still in the same vein. I'm like, this is exactly what's going on with my mom in hospice. So I need to bring this forth.
Mm-hmm.
So the kickbacks, you know that you think that some of it is that some nurses do that. How much are we talking to literally sell your soul to the devil? Because that's what you're doing if you're killing these people in hospice.
Well, they are. And I'll tell you a case in Frisco, Texas, with Bradley Harris, and he was the CEO of Novus Hospice, which has been shut down since that time. And he was making hand over fist money, charging the government all of this money for Medicare. And he had 2 doctors that were giving him patients and enrolling them and saying that they met the criteria when they did not, which your mother probably didn't either, but they met the criteria. And he would send text messages to Jessica Love, which is the nurse there. Interesting that she has the name Love on that, and she's a psychopath. But he would send her text messages and say, this person's living too long, do something about it. And that night in her shift, she'd give them a little bit more morphine, roll them on their left side, and they would be dead. And he would send messages to her that said, find me somebody and make them go bye-bye. And she would. Those people, there are 14 people, Bradley Harris, his wife, Jessica Love, the 2 doctors, the medical director of the facility, and several other nurses are serving time in prison, 64 years, I believe, total, all of them federal prison for fraud, not for murder, not for destroying people's lives and families, but for the fraud, because the government wants their money. And sadly, now I know with RFK that, they're kind of cracking down on, the hospices and organ harvesting, which is another big story. But they're starting to crack down on that. But again, it's for fraud. It's not for taking lives. It's not for out and out murder. And I'd like to go back to what you said, your point about Dr. Kevorkian, and agree with you 100%. Those people went to Dr. Kevorkian and said, I want to die. People that are enrolled in hospice do not say, I want to die. They are tricked into going in because they are told that you will have more of a quality of life if you come into hospice. Your life will be shorter. There is no quality to somebody taking you off of your medication so that now you can't breathe, or now that you're coughing a lot, or you're starting to have your blood pressure's going up because you've had your blood pressure removed, or your cancer medication has been taken away. That is not comfort. And a lot of them, they've even said, somebody that's diabetic, that we're not going to pay for your insulin. So you're a diabetic and now you're not going to get insulin. So some of the facilities will say they will let you keep taking your medication. And some of them are just downright opposed to it. And they'll tell you straight up, you're going to have to stop taking your medication. Case of Mary Nettles, she was taking medication for, I believe it was COPD. And the nurse came in day 1 and said, that you went through her pill box and took out the pills for her illness and said, we're not doing this anymore. So her daughter noticed that she was starting to feel bad and that the pills had been taken out. She put the pills back in because they still had some left, right? So even though hospice wasn't going to pay for them anymore, the hospice nurse had taken them out, made her go cold turkey. The daughter put them back in. And when the nurse came back the next week and the mother, Mary, started doing better, when the nurse came back the following week, she noticed that the pills were in there and she yelled at Mary Nettles and said, I told you we're not doing this anymore. The doctor has told you there's nothing we can do for you. And for you to insist on taking these medication, that's just wrong. And so she was talked into letting them take her off of the medication again. What was clear, the medication was keeping her more comfortable. It was prolonging her life, and they didn't want that. It's sinister.
Wow. I could be here all night on this. Let's move on. We're going to have you back for sure. My next question for you is, how did you decide to get into podcasting and have your show Betrayed by Hospice? over all of this?
Well, I was on Marty Oakley's show telling my story my mother died on June the 20th, 2017. And it took me 6 months to find Ron Panzer, who, and I thought that, again, that my mother was killed because they wanted to protect my dad and keep him safe from having to take care of my mom. He was put in the hospice room, respite facility across the hall from my mother, which they don't do that, but he was put there. So I thought the case was unique. I found Ron Panzer. He was a hospice nurse, and he wrote the book, Stealth Euthanasia, Healthcare Tyranny. And I found him, and he told me, no, it's not because your mom's unique. This is happening all over. So from that, I found Marty Oakley. I was on her program, and she said, this is big. We need somebody to be talking about hospice. Will you come on and do a podcast with hospice? And, I debated, do I really want to get into this? And, but I'm kind of hard-headed, and I'm like, you murdered my mom and I'm not going to let it go. So I started doing the podcast and letting people come on like myself and tell their story about their loved one, losing their loved one. And I have maintained relationships with a lot of those people that first came on my program. And then in February of 2024, I just felt that God wanted me to do more, that there was another avenue, there was something else that I should be doing. And I thought, all of these people have, told me their story. Maybe I should put it in a book. And so that's when I started writing the book, and it took me a year to write it. And then it was published in March of this year. But it's not all the stories. There's 34 stories in the book. But it was just a sampling of them, different ages, different diseases, different states. But the drugs are all the same. And, the lies, the manipulation are all the same. And the other drug, one of the things that we've seen memes that the nurses on their pages, the hospice nurses, they talk about the ham sandwich, and that if a patient is combative, or if the family is argumentative, or if the patient tries to get out of the bed, that they'll give you a ham sandwich. Well, not even knowing what that is, if somebody's threatening to do that to me if I don't do this, then I'm assuming that's a bad thing. But a ham sandwich is Haldol, Ativan, and morphine. And we've already talked about, that Ativan is for anti-anxiety, and morphine is an opioid, a narcotic, that if you're not used to having it, you're called opioid naive. And so you're going to react stronger to that than somebody else. Plus, if you're over 65, it's not going to regulate in your blood as well as it would in a younger person. Well, now let's add Haldol. Haldol is an antipsychotic that is used for bipolar people. And when you talk about adding an antipsychotic in with an opioid and an anxiety, you're going to put them in a coma very, very quickly, where they can't talk, they can't communicate, they can't eat, they can't drink. Ultimately, they die from the drugs, dehydration, and starvation. So that was kind of my journey to, going from my mother being murdered to doing the podcast and having other victims come on, as well as people that knew, had worked in this field, like attorneys, doctors, different agencies that were trying to help people from hospice.
Can you tell us a little bit about your book and why people should read it?
The book has 34 stories in it from individuals like myself. My mother's story is obviously in there in great detail. And it has a chapter in there about brain death and organ harvesting, which is a huge program itself. It also has medical aid in dying and why assisted suicide, whichever way you put it, it's still ending somebody's life. The problem is that's a slippery slope. And the doctors sign a HIPAA form that says they will do no harm to people. So when you go in and you ask a doctor to kill me because I have an illness, or because I'm depressed, or because, my loved one has dementia and I don't want to deal with them, then the person may feel that they're a burden to their family and they don't want to be. A person that is depressed could, I don't want to live anymore. And, that's a temporary problem, but it's a permanent solution. So it's that slippery slope. It has a chapter in there on the drugs and the drug interactions. And it also has links in there that will tell you where you can go look. Don't just take my word for it. I want you to go look for yourself. But a lot of people, like my son's grandmother-in-law, she doesn't have the ability to Google. She doesn't know anything about that, or DuckDuckGo, and she wouldn't be able to look anything up. So it's in the book, written, typed in, and then it has the link if you're so inclined to look that up yourself. So it kind of covers both, for the elderly that don't get on the internet. It has chapter 15 is resources chapter that lays out all the different resources you can go to get help, whether it be legal or, nurses' questions, people that know more than I know and can help. It gives you their contact information. The proof, it tells the people, that's just the story I told you about. Bradley Harris is just one of the stories among many that is in the book. So it just has a lot, 481 pages. When I say you should research, knowledge is power, I took the research that I've done over the past 8 years and consolidated it and put it in a book. And a very dear friend of mine said that she thought that the book should just be about the stories. And the stories are sad. They're depressing. I've had, people that have said to me, I can't read but one or two a day because, they just break my heart. I wouldn't want to just give you a book of sad stories and then just kind of end it there without telling you what you can do to save your loved one and to protect yourself. And there are things you can do, documentation, paperwork. Being an organ donor is a very dangerous thing now. There's a form that you can get that says, I refuse to be an organ donor. It's just full of information to save your life, literally.
In closing, is there anything you would like to say to your fans or readers out there?
Knowledge is power. I think that's what I believe, that you have to research. I don't think you can trust what people tell you. I think you need to trust your gut. And if something appears wrong to you, then you need to question it and you need to be fierce about it. And if your loved one is sitting up and talking and eating and drinking and, is doing okay, and all of a sudden now you're not able to talk to you, they're not able to eat or drink, they can't think, there's something seriously wrong. And it isn't just their time to die. They've been drugged. And the respite care, I went over that very briefly, but respite care is when the hospice says to you, we're going to take your loved one for just a couple of days while you get some rest, and then we'll give them back to you. Not one single person that I have ever talked to that went into respite care, their loved one came out in a body bag on a gurney. And there are at least 4 stories in there. There are stories in there about COVID. There's a chapter in there about the COVID protocol and what was the safest to do and what they did do and why I say that, what those medications were. So it explains that. And then in the beginning, there's history of what hospice was meant to be and what it has become. So knowledge is power is the best thing I can tell you. Do your research. Don't trust what you're told. It's dangerous out there.
Well, I thank you for being on the show today. I want to give the audience and maybe yourself some context of how I came to be in all of this, because I do believe that sometimes God just puts people in your pathway that you need to hook up with. Didn't know anything about this community, didn't know a lot about hospice, didn't even know this existed until one day I had got an invitation on Podmatch from TS Radio Network and the Marty Oakley Show. They were asking me to come on their show. So that they wanted to talk podcasting, what I knew about it, some tech tips, things of that nature. And when I was looking into the show, I'm like, I don't know if I fit, but I'll agree to go. At that point, that's where I met Cos. who is the host now currently. For those of you who do not know, unfortunately, Marty Oakley has passed away, and Kaz has been the chosen one to continue on her mission. Exactly. So you take this little shy, timid young woman, because that's what she looks like to be. She has this little tiny voice. And when I met her, she was like, I don't know what I'm doing. I want this podcast to be the next level. I'm taking over for Marty. And so I went on the show, did, what we were going to do. And then I said, what does your show really do? What was Marty Oakley about? What is T.S. Network? And so she explains to me about all this stuff about hospice and that people's dying in hospice, and that she has all these sponsors that's from across the world that's helping with this. And I said, don't take this wrong. I says, but you're doing your show on Zoom and you have no editing. I said, that's not going to go for a show like yours. I said, I've listened to your show and it's good. I says, but when you have certain things is in the mix, we need to get those out. So I agreed at that point. She goes, I don't know what I'm doing, who to hire. I said, I got you. So we agreed at that point that day to come to an agreement of where we could work together. And so then I became the producer of the TS Radio Network and the Marty Oakley Show. Soon after that, I get contacted by her and says, well, she's a part of our network. Do you mind throwing Marsha Joiner in the mix? I'm sure. I said, sure. Who is that? And what does she do? She goes, well, she has known Marty forever, and Marty got her into podcasting, but now she has her own show called Betrayed by Hospice. I said, so this is going to be kind of a separate show from yours. She goes, yes, but it's sponsored by the network. So then that's when I first heard your shows come in with people that was having these same stories that you had. Some were better, some were worse, but they all ended up the same. And so I reached out to Kaz. I says, I hate to ask, I says, but did you think Marsha would come on my show? I says, because I do a true crime show. This is true crime, and it's crime that nobody knows about. And I hinted to her, I said, I believe my mom was murdered by hospice. Now, I never told her the whole story because I wanted to wait till I got you on the show in which to do that. So now she will learn that. So I wanted to give some context to the audience and to yourself of how I came to be involved in this. And now I am producing both your show as well as Marty Oakley Show. And I'm very proud and happy in which to do so, because this is something that needs to be put out in the clearest form possible. So I thank you for allowing me to be a part of your world.
Well, thank you for getting things out, for your podcast and for helping us with our podcast. So I think it is definitely something that people need to know. It is a crime. Murder is the biggest crime there is, and betrayal of our people.
I 100% agree. We will have you back because I do want to do a deep dive into your book. We'll talk about some of those stories there. This is not the end. I'm also looking for other people that wants to come on the show, because this, I'm thinking, should be a permanent segment, and we should have some cases like this so that we can give the audience the knowledge they need in case they do face this situation. So I thank you, Marsha, for coming on the show today. It's been very enlightening, and I look forward to having you back again.
Okay. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
All right, guys, that was the incredible Marsha Joiner. You can get your copy of Betrayed by Hospice and Healthcare, Stories from the Deathbed at Amazon. The link will be in the show notes of this episode. Especially if you're doing digital, it's not that expensive a book. $9.99 will get you that digital copy, just a few bucks more if you want a physical one. I know the money that she makes, she puts a lot of it back into what she's doing. So when you look at what she's doing, as well as Marty Oakley Show, the TS Radio Network, the Marty Oakley Show with Kaz, this is where we need to be, making sure we put some resources into. They're doing God's work out there. So again, thanks, Marsha, for joining. I thank you guys for joining us today. I know you have many choices in true crime and interview podcasts. I am grateful that I am one of your choices. And remember that you have been listening to the only three-faceted podcast of its kind. Be good to yourself and each other, and always remember, always stay humbled. An act of kindness can make someone's day. A little love and compassion can go a long way. And remember that there is an extraordinary person in all of us. I'll catch you guys on the next one.
Don't forget to rate, comment, and subscribe. Join us on social media. One link to the link tree has it all. Feel free to drop us a line at truecrimeandauthors@gmail.com. Cover art and logo designed by Arslan. Sound mixing and editing by David McClam. Intro script by Sophie Wild and David McClam. Theme music, Legendary, by New Alchemist. Introduction and ending credits by Jackie Voice. See you next time on True Crime, Authors, and Extraordinary People.